When the Lamb broke the third seal, I heard the third living being say, "Come." And I looked up and saw a black horse, and its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard a voice from among the four living beings say, "A loaf of wheat bread or 3 loaves of barley will cost a day's pay, and don't waste the olive oil and wine." When the third seal is opened, the third cherubim calls forth a rider on a black horse. This image represents economic collapse and hyperinflation, which leads to famine. We've already seen this dynamic in action during the 2008 financial crisis. Previously comfortable families were plunged into poverty and began struggling to pay for food. For example, the Trussell Trust reported that UK food bank use rose by 170% in 2013. In the United States, Gleaners Indiana Food Bank reported that 50 million Americans, that's 1 in 6, were experiencing food insecurity in 2012. The Bible tells us that the world's economy is going to become increasingly unstable and will suffer an even bigger collapse in the future, and this will lead to a period of still worse financial turmoil. When we consider that national debts are now so astronomical that they can never be paid back and are increasing by the second, we begin to understand that the whole world is sitting on an economic time bomb. In fact, if you go to nationaldebtclocks.org, you can watch world debt rising in real time. When this financial collapse takes hold, it will cost a whole day's wages just to buy 1 loaf of wheat bread. Barley will be slightly less affected, but even so, 1 day's wages will only buy 3 barley loaves. People are going to be struggling just to survive.
What could upset your outlook? Are there any kind of big events, macro events, that could change the story for you in terms of where you're putting your money?
Oh, sure, worldwide collapse. If Spain suddenly goes bankrupt, Italy suddenly goes bankrupt, and they might, and they well might, but it doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. But eventually, Amanda, of course, the whole world's going to collapse. We in the West have staggering debts. The United States is the largest debtor nation in the history of the world. This is going to end badly. We're all floating around on a sea of artificial liquidity right now, Amanda. This is not going to last. No. And when it ends, the bull market in commodities will probably end too. But the bull market in a lot of stuff will end.
There's an interesting nuance to this passage that's worth pointing out. It says, "A loaf of wheat bread or 3 loaves of barley will cost a day's wages, but don't harm the olive oil and wine." Bread is a cheap dietary staple. However, olive oil and wine represent expensive luxury items, and it seems that they won't be touched by the crisis. What the Bible appears to suggest here is that the inflation and food shortages will be an issue for the middle and working class folks only, but it will have almost no impact on the rich. We saw this dynamic in the aftermath of 2008 too. While many working people lost their homes and fell into poverty in the years following the collapse, and while tax hikes squeezed the middle classes to breaking point, manufacturers and retailers of prestige brands and luxury goods actually reported increased sales figures. In other words, the super rich were continuing to spend freely. The financial crisis hadn't caused them any discomfort. This has been the way throughout all history. When there is a rising tide of financial insecurity, the yachts are lifted, but the peasants drown. What we are witnessing today, and what will continue to occur in the future, is a widening gap between rich and poor. When the Lamb broke the fourth seal, I heard the fourth living being say, "Come." And I looked up and saw a horse whose colour was pale green. Its rider was named Death, and his companion was the Grave. These two were given authority over 1/4 of the earth to kill with the sword and famine and disease and wild animals. When the fourth seal is opened, the last cherubim calls forth a pale green horse, an image that represents death. Thankfully, I've never seen a dead body in the flesh, but I'm told that this is the colour that corpses turn. In other words, as a result of all this war, economic troubles, famine, diseases and natural disasters, death will inevitably follow hard on the heels of all those things. Now when it says, "These two were given authority over 1/4 of the earth," this is often interpreted as 1/4 of the planet's population will die. It may not mean that. It could just mean, and I think this is the more likely explanation, that 1/4 of the Earth's geographical area is going to be particularly badly affected, like the Middle East for example. Now that we've looked at the first 4 seals, it might be useful if we put them side by side with the Olivet Discourse. By doing so, we'll discover that they mirror each other almost exactly. During the Olivet Discourse, the first sign that Jesus gave was false messiahs, false prophets, and false religion. So it's interesting that when we turn to the first seal in Revelation, we see a white horseman representing false messiahs, false prophets, and false religion. The second sign that Jesus gave was an increase in wars and threats of war. Again, when we turn to the second seal in Revelation, we read about a red horseman who has authority to take peace from the earth, and of war and of slaughter. The third thing that Jesus talks about on the Mount of Olives is famines and earthquakes all over the world. So when we turn to the third seal, we read about a black horseman who causes economic crises and famine in the world. The fourth thing that Jesus talked about in the Olivet Discourse was persecution, suffering, and death for following him. And again, when we turn to the fourth seal, we read about a pale green horseman representing death and the grave. There seems to be quite a clear correlation between the two passages, and if it's a valid comparison to make, we should also note that around the third seal, marked by economic collapse and famine, Jesus tells us there will be an increase in natural disasters. Here's a graph from the International Disaster Database that illustrates how this is happening right now. Scientists warn that this trend is going to continue in the years ahead, attributing the phenomenon to man-made climate change. While the theory of man-made climate change is debatable, the Bible makes it clear that they're right to predict increased volatility in the natural world. Every time you turn on the news and see a tsunami, a flood, an earthquake or a hurricane causing devastation in some part of the world, you're actually witnessing the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And that raises an important question. Where exactly are we in the prophecy timeline? We've seen there will be an increase in false prophets and religion, and that's already happening. We've seen there will be an increase in wars, and that's already happening. We've seen there will be an increase in economic crises, food poverty and wealth disparity, and that's already happening. And we've seen there will be an increase in natural disasters and disease, and that's already happening too. With this in mind, I believe that we can legitimately entertain the idea that the first 4 seals have already been opened and we're already experiencing the beginning of the birth pains. The news channels seem to confirm this with every passing day. Many people want to know where we are in the timeline of events and how long we have to wait until Jesus returns. No one can answer that question accurately. However, Jesus did tell us that we would be able to discern when the time was approaching. He said, "Now learn a lesson from the fig tree. When its branches bud and its leaves begin to sprout, you know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see all these things, you can know that his return is very near, right at the door." Since we can indeed observe all these things happening in our world right now, we might not be at the end, but we can say with a certain degree of confidence that we're at the beginning of the end. And although we don't know how long the birth pains will last, we can say with some justification that they've already begun. That should focus our minds as we consider how to live in the times ahead. When the 4th seal is broken and there's an increase in death in the world, it appears as though that's especially going to be true for Christians. Jesus says during the Olivet Discourse, "Then you will be arrested, persecuted and killed. You will be hated all over the world because you are my followers." As we've already noted, while that has always been true, while Christians have always been hated, persecuted and martyred for their faith throughout history, there will be a noticeable increase towards the end. In the same way that there have always been false prophets, but they're going to increase. In the same way that there's always been wars, but they're going to increase. In the same way that there's always been financial difficulties and famines, but they're going to increase. In the same way that there's always been natural disasters, but they're going to increase. There's always been persecution for being a Christian, but it's going to increase significantly. In fact, this may even be describing a kind of end-time genocide. Earlier I quoted the International Society for Human Rights, the secular observatory based in Frankfurt, Germany, who said that 80% of all acts of religious discrimination in the world today are now directed at Christians. Statistically speaking, that already makes Christians by far the most persecuted religious body on the planet, right now, today. The Spectator recently published an article which said, "In effect, the world is witnessing the rise of an entire new generation of Christian martyrs. The carnage is occurring on such a vast scale that it represents not only the most dramatic Christian story of our time, but arguably the premier human rights challenge of this era as well." Even places which were relatively safe for Christians are now becoming dangerous. In Iraq, Christians numbered 1.5 million in 1991. Today it's estimated that their number is closer to 150,000. That represents a 90% decrease in just over 20 years. No wonder some experts are predicting the extinction of Christianity from the Middle East. And then in other parts of the world, stories like these are increasingly common.
They know that we are Christians. I am a Christian. That is why you are here to attack me. You said, yes, I told you, we've been telling you people to convert to Islam, but people refuse. So the only thing is to get rid of all of you and inherit all that you have. If you women say you will not convert to Islam and marry us, then we'll kill all of you, even you and your children and your daughters.
We started the praise and worship, not even 5 minutes into it. All of a sudden we heard someone screaming. Then we saw the stranger, walking in, and my younger brother, he was there, and he went to ask him what's wrong. He all of a sudden started punching him in the face.
I was trying to stop them, but they pushed me hard.
They were shouting and saying that stop this church and we don't want to hear all this nuisance.
Christians are being chased, hounded, persecuted and killed in increasing numbers all over the world. This is a catastrophe of biblical proportions, literally. Even in the West, we're seeing a noticeable rise in anti-Christian, anti-Christ sentiment. Reports are coming through with increasing regularity of home churches being shut down, street preachers being jailed under hate speech charges for saying that Jesus Christ is Lord, Christian business owners being targeted for opposing homosexuality, and all mentions of God being removed from schools and halls of government. Right now, the persecution in the West hasn't led to waves of martyrdom or even much physical violence. But just as Nero's persecution of the Christians began small, confiscation of property, illegalization of the faith, and imprisonment, and then escalated, that's how waves of martyrdom generally begin. We must stay vigilant as Antichrist sentiment rises in the world. Anyone who has studied German attitudes towards the Jews in the 1930s will know that this is exactly how the Holocaust began too. At first it was just a whispering campaign, verbal abuse, then boycotts in Jewish businesses, confiscation of property and vandalization of homes. Before long, they were being blamed for all of society's ills, just as Nero had blamed Christians for all of Rome's, and they were being carted off to concentration camps and gas chambers. We must not be complacent. Anti-Christian sentiment will certainly increase and get more severe as we get closer to the time of the Antichrist himself. Jesus says that many will buckle under the increasing pressure of this hatred from the world and will renounce their faith for the sake of comfort.